Right, hello and welcome everyone to the third and final webinar in the series of online discussions on truth-telling, slavery and the Anglican Church. This series has been held in advance of the flagship International Anglican Convening planned by the Church of England Racial Justice Unit in 2025 in Liverpool to explore the historical involvement of the Church in slavery and colonialism and the actions to progress healing and racial justice. The Church of England Racial Justice Unit is guided by the Archbishop's Anti-Racism Task Force report, From Lament to Action, and also by the work to address the Church Commissioner's report on historic links to transatlantic slavery. My name is Dr. Leona Vaughan. I'm a research fellow at the University of Liverpool, and I've produced, hosted and promoted this series with colleagues at the Centre for the Study of International Slavery to support the Church of England's Racial Justice Unit to build an online repository of research and knowledge on this topic, which is open to all. This webinar is being recorded, and all recordings, not including the question and answer, are made available via the CSIS website, and my colleagues will share a link to that during the session. Each webinar is accompanied by recommendations for further reading and information from the experts we've brought together from communities, institutions and academia from across the UK, as well as across the transatlantic diaspora. The opening webinar, People Not Property, Names Not Numbers, outlines the relationship between the Anglican Church and slavery in terms of involvement, financial benefit, and the impact on religious teachings. The second webinar, Women, Slavery in the Church, considered specifically the role of women as enslavers and beneficiaries of African enslavement and their links to the Anglican Church, including religious justifications for keeping African-descended people in enslavement. This final webinar will spotlight the journey to confront and address the history of the Anglican Church in the Liverpool City region with slavery and move towards healing and repair. Liverpool, which will be the location of next year's convening, is a city itself steeped in the history of the transatlantic traffic and enslavement of Africans, and is home to the International Slavery Museum. So this webinar will be recorded and will be available online in the new year. So just some practical things during the panel discussion. So we'll have a 1-hour panel discussion. Participants are encouraged to raise questions using the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen. And we will pose these to the panel during the final 30 minutes of Q&A. Unfortunately, Lawrence Westgaff is unable to join the panel today, but our other panellists are here and will be introduced to you by our moderator, Novelette-Aldoni Stewart. So Novelette has extensive experience in both the UK and overseas as a conservator, curator and collections and heritage expert. Novelette has worked for a range of institutions, including the Horniman and British Museums in London. Her work abroad includes museum-related fieldwork in the Sub-Sahara and in the Pacific. She is currently studying for a doctorate as part of an AHRC, Arts and Humanities Research Council collaborative doctoral partnership between the British Museum and the Sainsbury Research Unit at the University of East Anglia. Novelette is also the chair of the Church Buildings Council. So Novelette, over to you.
I'd like to start off by warmly welcoming you all to this webinar. It's a very exciting group of series which I've had an opportunity to just go through. And I'd like to start off with a bit about me, just to give a bit of context to how I'm approaching this. Within the church, which I'm greatly couched, I've had the opportunity to work with the church commissioners in their report on the historic links that the church had with transatlantic chattel slavery, which resulted, as you know, in £100 million, which was initially mooted as a form of compensation or part of reparations for dealing with this. So I've also been very much involved in the contested heritage aspects of the Church of England, And contested heritage is it is what we see, what is in plain sight. It is what we see when we go into certain churches in terms of memorials to slavers, torturers. It is that in the church saying, how should we deal with these memorials? And questioning their mission and questioning how it links to pastoral care when people see it. And of course, we have that intergenerational trauma. So we've luckily had several objects removed. We've had people reconsider how they've approached it, reinterpretation of that, so that people are just not seen as, in some certain cases, as the sons and daughters of empire, but more or less as this is what you've done to your fellow man. I've had the great opportunity of working alongside the Archbishop's Council of Racial Justice, which is the overall program which put together by the two archbishops that really looked at creating opportunities for people to have an equal footing, equal say, for us to question what was happening in the church. And so it's been a great voice to showing the church where it really has been. I think one of the things that I was quite excited about being, asked to participate in this was the fact of things being in hidden sight, things because we are couched in the idea that the past is a foreign country. They did things different there, and which is the great excuse where, oh, that happened 100 years ago, that happened 200 years ago, that happened 500 years ago. We don't really have to deal with it. In fact, we do. We're still dealing with it. So that's a bit about me and why I'm here, and feel very privileged to be asked. A bit about the panelists who've come here, who are equally strong people. I have Dr. Malik Al-Nazir, who is an author, a poet, an academic from Liverpool. His memoirs, Letters to Gil, is a compelling account of his childhood experience in the brutal UK local authority care system. He is reading for a PhD in history at the University of Cambridge and was awarded an honorary D.Litt from the Liverpool Hope University. His research is in the enslavement of his ancestors by Liverpool firm Sandbag Time and Co. in the Mare. He is also the co-founder of Black Academia, and is co-authored and co-edited the papers and policy briefing published in 2024. I'm also joined by Malcolm Rogers. Malcolm Rogers, the Bishop of Liverpool's canon for reconciliation, and is also vicar of St. Gabriel's Church. I'm in Horton Quarry. He's been in that post for 25 years. Malcolm also established a series of community festivals to promote cohesion and challenge far-right narratives, especially after the 2005 murder of Anthony Walker just yards from the front door of St. Gabriel's. Then in 2012, Malcolm helped to set up the Triangle of Hope International Reconciliation Project, which engages with young people from Africa, Liverpool, and United States. In 2016, he received an MBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours List for his community cohesion work locally and internationally. I'm also joined by Jennie Taylor. Jennie Taylor is the Racial Justice Officer for Liverpool's Diocese and Cathedral. In her role, she supports Anglican churches and schools across Liverpool Diocese as they work together for racial justice in their communities. Working in partnership with other dioceses and the National Racial Justice Unit, Jennie leads locally on the on the implementation of the Church of England's national strategy vision, From Lament to Action. Jennie's passionate about encouraging the contributions and participation of marginalized groups in every part of church life, both locally and nationally. I'd like to thank you, and I welcome you all. I think I'm now going to ask my panelists I'm going to ask them a series of questions, which I'm sure they're going to, I'm going to jump in because they're very, very strong and very thoughtful and sometimes probably very painful questions, but they're questions that need to be asked. And the first of these questions is, what do you believe was the greatest obstacles you faced in undertaking your work for the truth about Liverpool's slavery and the church? And how did you overcome this? How did you overcome this obstacle? And I'd like to start with Dr. Malik Al-Nasir.
Thank you very much, Novelette, for having me here today, and for Leona Vaughan and CSIS and Mal and all the people at the church who've organised this today, and for the honour of being invited to come and speak to you. My research was not specifically about the church. My research was primarily concerned with tracing my own ancestry back through enslavement and colonialism, from West Africa through the Caribbean, particularly Demerara in what was then British Guyana. And in the course of my ancestral journey, if you like, trying to connect with my pre-colonial kind of roots, I uncovered connections to enslavement, colonialism, but also extensive links to the church. Now, in the manner in which I approached my research, because I was looking through a genealogical lens, I only focused on the characters that I found within my family tree. And of course, due to the extensive amount of sexual exploitation, particularly of African women during the period of chattel slavery, which was done on an industrial scale, very few of the progeny of those who had been enslaved in the Caribbean did not have some sort of connection to a white bloodline, and in many cases that come as a result of rape. So in my particular case, I found that the enslavers that were involved in the trafficking of my ancestors from Africa, the enslavement of them, the brutalization and the sexual exploitation of them, that they were very heavily involved in financing churches. Two of them were canonized. You look at the Church of St. Philip and St. John in The Hague, which is a Church of England. It's the namesakes John Abram Tinney and Philip Frederick Tinney, namesakes of the firm Sandbach, Tinney & Co., which is a Liverpool firm that enslaved my ancestors. John Abram Tinney was the second largest recipient of slavery compensation at the end of emancipation, just post-emancipation. And will give you an idea of the level of his engagement and involvement. And for him then to be canonized, given this saintly status because he was building a church in The Hague, is absurd. You will also notice, if you go along to the Walker Art Gallery, there is an exhibit of marble reliefs on the wall, which were taken from Hafodunus Hall, which was a stately home in Denbighshire, the home of Samuel Sandbach and his son, Henry Robertson Sandbach, also namesake of the firm Sandbach, Tinney & Co. of Liverpool. And there is a marble relief there, which was crafted by the sculptor John Gibson, called Suffer the Children to Come Unto Me. And in the marble relief, you have Jesus in the center. And on the left-hand side, you have Henry Robertson Sandbach, the slave trader. And on the right-hand side, you have John Gibson, the sculptor. And then you have the children coming unto Jesus. And if you go to Samuel Sandbach's house, Hafodunus Hall, all around the middle floor, you will see the Psalms of David that have been, they're actually in the tiles. So these people were very instrumental in funding the church. And in 1823, after the Demerara Uprising, along with the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, the SPCK, they were among the exponents of promoting the slave Bible, which more than 1,000, books, that make up the Bible, chapters or whatever. This had about 10% of that. And the slave Bible was extrapolated from the New Testament with a specific objective of Christianizing the enslaved population, but only teaching them the things that regarded obedience.
Yes,
and
because if we go through the slave Bible, we'll know that certain sections were actually taken out,
Genesis and Revelation.
But going to the point, which is the truth telling, and it's the idea of things being hidden in plain sight. Was that the obstacle that you faced?
The obstacle that I faced was access to the archival documents. That was the primary obstacle. Having access to the archives will give you the opportunity to be able to read firsthand what was taking place. The slave traders moved from a model of not allowing enslaved populations to know Christianity because they didn't want them to have human aspirations. They wanted them to be content to be property, and they were subhuman. And there was whole volumes of ecclesiastical jurisprudence written about them being a subspecies from Africa that somehow survived the floods of Noah and were not on the boat with Noah and were not of the progeny of Ham and Shem, and therefore could be classed as non-people and therefore property. And then the laws were based upon that. They were allowing them to enslave.
So I'm gathering you said it was the archives, and you speak on the idea of us being considered the children of Ham. And I think that is something that, we go through later on, because if you're the children of Ham, it becomes excusable. It almost becomes sanctioned that you can do these things to these people because they're, as you said, lesser people. And at that point, I'd like to pull in Jennie Taylor in on this, because Jennie, you work with the church. What did you feel an obstacle?
Oh, thank you so much, Novelette, also for the very kind introduction before, and to Leona for inviting me to join. I do work with churches in Liverpool Diocese as well as with our schools, and I would say one of the large obstacles, I suppose, for us that we've had in talking about African enslavement, and particularly the role of the church, has been helping people to understand the link between the past and the present. So it's about answering that question: how does the church's involvement in the enslavement of Africans between the 15th and the 19th century, how does that impact racism in churches today, with people right now who are sitting in pews, using our buildings, connecting with us, joining us for worship? And I guess that barrier can sometimes stop us from even leaning into this conversation at all. This idea that it's got nothing to do with me, it's got nothing to do with now, leave the past in the past, and means that we've not always been open to listening to the stories of other people, to different knowledge that we may not have, to the perspectives of others. But it is a really important part of our ability to move forwards, isn't it? So that we can actually understand the markers of structural racism, both within society, but also within our own church systems. And if we don't listen to history, we will miss those markers, or we'll think that they don't exist at all. I think the reality is that truth telling is it's always costly, isn't it? It's always really costly. And for the church, so all of us as congregants, I guess, there's this cost of having to be humble enough and willing to listen and to learn, to put down our assumptions about what we already know. And in doing so, it allows us to build relationships where we can actually listen and listen to others, hear them, collaborate together. I think in terms of sort of overcoming that obstacle, I do think for the church that overcoming is to some extent done through faith, isn't it? I think the thing that has helped with the Liverpool Diocese has definitely been encouraging all of our congregants to embody the fourth mark of mission, which is a mission to transform unjust structures, to challenge violence of every kind, to pursue peace and reconciliation. And I think that perspective has been something that has helped us to look backwards so that we can look forwards, so that we can take in the past and see what has happened, and then be really clear about the things that do need to be dismantled, the things that we do need to challenge. And because it's a missional call that's shared across the church, it stops it being something which is for a select few to do, that actually the dismantling of that obstacle is everybody's business, regardless of who you are, where you're from, what your background or culture is. If you consider yourself to be part of the Church of England, then this is for you to get involved in, because bringing peace and reconciliation both in our churches and in the communities we serve is part of our expression of faith to the world around us. So I guess it is a really big obstacle, and I'm not sure, Novelette, that I don't think we've cracked it by any stretch of the imagination. I really don't. But I do think there is a desire to overcome it, to sit in the discomfort of recognising the church's past, but also in understanding the impact that it's having today with people all over our country, but also people who sit in our churches, who worship with us every single week. So I think it's an ongoing obstacle, really, that we're trying to overcome.
No, I thank you. Thank you so much, Jennie. And I think, it's this idea of truth telling, because question is, here's the contestation. Whose truth? And who's going to listen? Because it's a reciprocal thing. You have to, somebody can tell you their truth, but if you don't want to hear, if you don't want to listen, and this is the point we're at now, as you know, in the church, is to get people to sit there and go, we have to be humble, we have to be still, we have to listen to progress, because things are so invested.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Novelette. I think there's great power in learning to sit in the discomfort of hearing somebody else's story that challenges your own perception of what might be true, and recognise that, as a church, there is culpability in that. Yes. And it is uncomfortable, and we definitely don't like it. But truth is often uncomfortable, and it's also good.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And Malcolm, I'm coming to you.
Thank you, Jennie. I echo Jennie and Malik's thanks, Novelette, for including me in this, and to Leona and all of the team. Thank you so much. I also echo an awful lot of what Jennie has just said there as well. You just stole my preparation, Jennie, in some aspects. I think in order to add to that, I think I'd want to start by saying one of the biggest obstacles I needed to recognise really was my own acute ignorance. Coming into these discussions, into these considerations, really. Although I experienced some challenging circumstances as a young lad, being a white man living in the UK in Liverpool gave me a privilege which made it really hard, I think, for me to see and hear and receive the truth about the city I love, about the church I love, concerning chattel slavery and the enslavement of millions of Africans. I needed to kind of start there, really, in my journey with this is what was there, but which I didn't see. A bit like when you go, round in front of Martin's Bank in Liverpool and the reliefs are there. I've walked past that building hundreds and hundreds of times and never seen what was actually there. And that was my reality, really, growing up in the church, growing up in this amazing city, but being really just unaware and ignorant of a lot of what we're talking about today. So that's the place where I started, that own internal obstacle, really, which I had to face. And I'm ashamed to say it was really only in 2005, and you mentioned this in the introduction, that kind of introduction, Novelette. It really was only in 2005 that I really began to just even begin to understand the fact that neighbours of mine, members of this parish, members of this community, they lived just alongside, but lived in entirely different worlds, really. And the murder of Anthony in 2005, July 2005, just 18 years old, just a few hundred yards from my front door. Really, and the ministry that I was called to in that moment, a pastoral ministry, which has led to a very deep friendship with G and other members of his family, has really opened my eyes and hopefully my heart as well to a whole area of life within the church, which and need and longing within the church, which we weren't there at all, and we're still not there. As Jennie has said, it's a work in progress by God's grace, but we are in a different place now, I think, locally and regionally and nationally. So and as I became more aware through that learning, through that journey, through that friendship of the prejudices in society, and I became more aware of those kinds of historical and very tightly held prejudices within the life of the church as well. And started asking questions about why certain things were done in the way that they were done, and really becoming more and more uncomfortable with some aspects of church life. I remember speaking to some local senior leaders of the church. I think it was shortly after Anthony was murdered, and saying to them about sharing with them some of these questions that I was starting to ask, and really just showing the shock in myself of recognizing the very steep learning curve that I felt that I was on, and really how ill prepared I felt I'd been through seminary, through the whole of my formation as a Christian, through the local church. And I remember being equally shocked, and one of our senior leaders thanked God, and I'm looking down here because it sticks with me, and I'm reading my notes here. Thank God that Liverpool Diocese was not like other places in that we didn't have any direct involvement with slavery, and neither is it a diocese that has a problem with racism. Luke 18 verse 10 comes to mind. Thank God I'm not like the other. I was really shocked because even at that early point in my journey, I knew that simply wasn't true. That was not a truthful position to hold. Corporate ignorance, which is not a passive position, but an example of racism itself, of course, was, and in some ways still is, a challenge. That's what we're here. That's why we're here. I know I don't need to tell anybody that. Here in Liverpool, we are on a journey, though, which, as Jennie has mentioned, a journey which has at its core a mission to be Christ-like, which means to be truthful. For me, the biggest barrier, the biggest obstacle is helping people to discern what is true and what isn't, and being truthful is Christ. Like, the truth sets us free, truthful about our resources, about our built heritage, about our churches, cathedral, about our members past and present. We had to go at naming some of this stuff in the book Liverpool Slavery in the Church that Ken Pye, a local historian, wrote a couple of years ago. We also have the Slavery Truth Project operating in the cathedral around the diocese. I'm sure Jennie might mention a bit more of that. So these are the ways in which we're starting to overcome this satisfaction with that which isn't true, or even a sense of multiple truths or multiple perspectives. No, actually, it's the truth that sets us free. The truth, I believe, that is found in Jesus. So one of our biggest attempts really to move in this direction has been the Triangle of Hope, which you mentioned we started in 2012, which is an international partnership between Liverpool and Kumasi, Ghana, and Virginia. I'll say a bit more about that later on if you want. But that program, which focuses on young people, on students, on different church structures, is all about recognizing our ignorance of what is true. I come from the Liverpool perspective in that, of course, recognizing our local ignorance and commitments across the piece to what is historically true, what is historically accurate. And that really has been the beginning of our transformation, naming that which is broken in our church life together. Of course, we've received pushback from those claiming other versions of the truth or to be able to rewrite history. The problem I come across with that is whenever I come across those rewrites or those different things, it always seems to perpetuate white privilege and white power. Those rewrites always seem to maintain those kinds of privileges and perspectives. As I say, it's the truth that sets us free. And the church I want to belong to is a church that speaks the truth after him who is the truth. So my biggest obstacle is ignorance to the truth. And how we overcome that is a commitment to the truth.
I just want to say,
sometimes
I'm listening to you, and I am really, at the risk of sounding really, and I don't mean it, I am not trying to in any way curry favor here, but I am just very impressed by your honesty, the fact that you're being humble, the fact that you recognize it, the fact that you are on journeys. Because I've spoken to people who are not even, who faced with the documentation in contested heritage. No, we still love this. We love this particular memorial. We love this, and we won't hear anything, and still remain, despite having all that information in front of them, still decide. And it is a decision, what I find that we make, a decision to be willfully ignorant of certain things. And as a Christian, it is about working through that each day to say, I don't know about you, but it doesn't align to my concepts of mission, doesn't align to my concept of what we were supposed to be doing as a religion. So I want to say, I thank you for that. I thank you for your vulnerability. I thank you for your recognition. But at the same time, I'm not saying that so as I'm in the sense of, aren't you a good boy? I'm saying that because it takes quite a lot of spiritual bravery knowing what the church is like. Knowing what the church is like and the road we still have to go. And before I go on, because I am conscious of time, I'm going to go to question 2. Okay, fine. And the question I have is, on question 2 is, in this journey, because I'm speaking about journey, how did you manage the challenges of different perspectives of truth? And was it possible to ensure all voices were heard? And I'm going to start, Malcolm, as you've started, I'd like you to continue.
Okay, it is a really difficult area, this, isn't it? So, I mean, I began by talking about listening, and in my own listening to myself and to others that has led me on this journey. In Huyton, I've ministered here now for 24 years, coming up to 25 years. And in 2005, I'd been here 5 years. At that point, I was made vicar here in 2000. And I was aware at that time, not particularly engaged with it, but there was a far right presence in this area. There was a vehicle that used to go around with a megaphone on the top of it, broadcasting all kinds of stuff. And I remember speaking against it a few times and things, but it wasn't really something that I was actively engaging with locally. Of course, when Anthony was murdered, that became very different, and particularly because the BNP found that that awful event quite energizing. And so I felt it was really important as a church to engage with narratives which we didn't believe to be true. Certainly those narratives which claim some kind of validation from the Bible or from the Lord. If we weren't going to do it, who was? And so we opened our doors, mostly in private, but sometimes in public. We began an engagement with those for whom, let me just name, some of their views I found utterly abhorrent, but it was important to at least have some kind of conversation. We began a whole series of cultural events. We deliberately chose St. George's Day for those cultural events to really go after that rhetoric which somehow claimed St. George as some kind of white hero figure, and so in those cultural events, which very many thousands of people ended up coming to them over the years. We explored the various patronages all around the world, the various foods, the culture, the dance, the writing, all of those things, and we just very deliberately wanted to undermine that which was being broadcast from the top of this vehicle and in the conversations in the pub, and all the rest of it that was going on in our community. We just wanted to undermine based on what we knew was being said. I mean, we only really got to know what was being said through some of those conversations. We tried to deliberately create safe places for people to share their fear, because what I discovered as well is some of these opinions, some of these perspectives came very much from a place of fear. And we wanted to be able to help people from that fear. as well, and the facts set us free as well, don't they? You know, sometimes people's fear is it's often whipped up. It wasn't the best way to be thinking about things. So one of the things that we did, we began a deliberate kind of presence out on the streets. In my church where I serve, there's a huge cross on the wall, and on the cross there's hundreds of little ribbons. And whenever there was an example of racially motivated violence, we went round the streets and allowed just ordinary folk from anywhere just to tie a ribbon to this cross with a hope for the streets, for something that said these streets are our streets, that all are welcome, that there's. And we've done that a number of times there. It stays in that church because it's a daily reminder that we're not done yet. You know, there are still people who are experiencing all kinds of prejudice and racially motivated harm and violence. What I'm trying to get to is that although we have these conversations, and although we've tried to do this kind of gentle undermining, there is a time when we have to know who we are, stand where we are, and be seen for who we are. And I think, you know, that has been a really important aspect of this. Yes, there might be perspectives on truth, but actually the truth is the truth. And one of the things that we're not willing to do is say that there are equally valid interpretations of what is historically the case.
No, I thank you for that, and I truly thank you on that. And also to have those visual reminders in your church as people. This is the truth. This is what we face. I'm going to go on to Jennie, if you could speak to us about, you know, your reflection on that question.
Yeah, I think the challenge of listening to different perspectives on the truth is one that is really intertwined with this work all of the time. I know for us here in Liverpool Diocese, one of the ways that challenge has presented itself most frequently is recognizing that when we're talking about the church and African enslavement in lots of our spaces, the majority of the people who are talking are not people who are directly impacted by it. And so the perspectives that then come out can tend to be quite academic, I would say, and they miss that these issues are not just in paper, in books, or even just on memorials on our walls, but that they have real human impacts on people, on individuals, on families, on whole communities. And it's that challenge of recognizing that one person's intellectual argument is actually another person's lived experience, and that their lived experience demands respect as members of humanity. And I guess I'm not sure that we've necessarily found a good way of doing this, but one of the ways we have done it, or attempted to meet that challenge, has been by co-creating some opportunities for people to speak in our spaces. So Liverpool Cathedral at the beginning of this year, March, I think, 2024, we had for the previous 18 months co-created an artistic piece of a photography exhibition made of 15 different people from a multiple of faiths and none, who were all sharing their reflections on the contested history monuments that exist within that building. Because we were really aware that whilst we're having these conversations, the people who are impacted most, they're not always in the room with us. And if I'm being honestly, Novelette, I would say it was really difficult for us as a church to let people share their stories without censoring them or defending against them. That probably was our largest challenge by far, as well as, I suppose, some of the challenges of people saying, well, you know, we don't really want to work with you because we don't think that you really care about this matter. We're not sure that this is really going to lead to anything. And we think, you know, maybe you just want to pat yourselves on the back and say, yeah, we're doing something. And we just really honest.
Pain.
Yeah, so we've had to honestly sit and listen to that pain and recognize that it's not based in, you know, it's based in people's reality of their experience with the church. It's not, you know, it's not random. It's because they honestly have felt unheard over time. But I think that experience for the cathedral and also other churches within the diocese who've used that same piece of artistic expression to start this work it has also been incredibly helpful to hear the voices of other people. And obviously, we've got lots of feedback from people. Some people were really, really welcomed the voices of African heritage people in those spaces to talk about these things. And equally, there were people who were very, very upset that we'd allowed people to speak they considered poorly about the church and its heritage. But it's been important for us to understand that if you really want to hear all the perspectives, that you're going to have to listen to the people that you don't agree with or that make you feel uncomfortable. And that way of the importance of that listening helps us to then break down some of those barriers around who gets heard in a space and who doesn't, whose perspective matters and whose doesn't. So I think it's been a really difficult thing for us to do as a diocese, but it's also been super valuable.
Yeah, really exactly. You need to share that truth telling from both sides. Yeah. And also, Malik, how would you approach that question? Malik, you're I think. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry. Firstly, I'd like to commend Mel, if I may, for the
Malik,
journey.
sorry, Malik.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I said I'd like to commend Mel for the journey that he's on. I think it's incredibly brave. I know the area that he's coming from. Heighton, I grew up in Belle Vale, just across the cornfields from there, and I know much of that far-right activity and how difficult it is to even challenge some of those notions. So I really do commend him on that journey, and I concur with much of what Jennie has also said. I am the subject of the very conversations that she's discussing. I'm a Muslim who was a Christian. I converted to Islam, and as a consequence of that, I have perspectives on both sides. I've studied the Bible, the Apocrypha, as well as studying the Quran and Islam. So I have a very different perspective, and some of my perspectives may be uncomfortable in a Christian setting because we have differences of, doctrine and fundamental beliefs. However, I feel it's really important to have this interfaith dialogue. And I've been in conversation with Jennie. I've also engaged with Dean Sue in those early discussions with regard to what the local, diocese can do, particularly in regard to the Liverpool Cathedral, to open up these conversations. And one of the points that I've made as one of the obstacles that many of us face in having this dialogue is that if everything is done through a Christian lens, starts off with a Christian prayer, is held in a Christian setting, is dictated with a certain predisposition to Christian doctrine, then you will alienate a number of people who do not share those beliefs. So what you need to do really, when you're thinking about the reparative element of what is occurring, much of that reparations doesn't just come in the form of, financial money like the Queen Anne Bounty and the reparatory fund that's being set up on the back of that. It comes in the repair of humans as well, and where the damage that was done to us by the church. I read the archival records, and I've been very, very heavily focused, for instance, on the missionary intelligences from the 19th century, from the early 19th century. So I can see the dialogue in sort of first-person dialogue that was being promoted when enslavement was occurring by the church to its missionaries going out to West Africa and the Caribbean to see precisely what it was that they were doing. And Mel, on your journey, I would very much suggest that you do have a look at that material, because this truth telling that you're grappling with and you're struggling with is not all just about the outcomes. We see those outcomes. It's about the origins, and we can't have access to those origins unless we understand what was done in the early stages, what role the church played in the promotion of the whole colonial enterprise. For instance, I'll give one example. When the Act of 1807 was being passed, at that point, the church was very involved in making arguments against enslavement. And they were making arguments against enslavement by presenting an alternative business model, which was actually colonialism. And it was saying that you're having these problems trafficking these people to the Caribbean, and you're doing all this wicked stuff to keep them in line. Wouldn't it be just so much easier if you could just exploit them where they are in Africa? And if you Christianize them, they'll be happy to give you their resources. They'll be happy to defer to Canterbury and York and even in some cases the Vatican. And they will know where their masters are. So you don't need to traffic them across the Atlantic. They'll give you the resources freely if they are Christians. So that much of the damage that was done was the Christianization on the coast of Africa, for instance, specifically with the purpose of exploiting the mineral resources, which has continued to this day in the form of colonialism. Now, having that dialogue with Christians is a difficult thing, because what it does is it challenges the very core of the belief of the goodness of the doctrine to which they adhere. So in the event that somebody who's not a Christian presents those ideas as historical fact, you will face the kind of pushback that Jennie was talking about, because it's not an easy or comfortable discussion or dialogue to have, but it is the historical truth. And what we need to be able to do is move the dial, when we're looking at the research elements of this, away from the doctrine of Christianity as the lens through which we see this, and bring it into the realm of the historical fact of what happened, and be willing to adjust and adapt our opinions based on what we find, and do so without fear or favor, regardless of the doctrine to which we adhere.
No, I thank you for that. And, I think that's I think there is something to be said there about what you've spoken about, alongside having things like critical race theory associating to actually deconstruct what we believe are truths. I'm going to tell you, I'm not supposed to say this for when you do a webinar, but because we only have an hour to get this, to speak about this, and I wish it was more. But I'm going to ask if it would be possible in the next two questions, if we could try to be a little bit more targeted, because I think there's a lot to be said, and I hope there's a part two to this. But I would really, there are two more questions, and I really want us to get through them, because I think you're bringing a lot of, all of you are bringing a lot to the table, and I apologize, there is only an hour. I really am invested in what you were saying, and please do send me emails after that. My next question is, what are you trying to add to public knowledge? I think this goes back to Malik's question about slavery and the church in Liverpool through this journey. Do you feel that such knowledge will lead to a better understanding of social, racial justice? If so, why? If not, why not? And I would appreciate if we could be concise, because there's another question after this. And I'm going to ask Jennie, if you could start.
Yeah, so to be honest, I think I'm probably following on from what Malik has just said about like where knowledge comes from and who gets to tell it. I think within my work in the diocese, the thing that I'm probably trying to add to public knowledge is, first of all, recognising in Liverpool, we have a whole host of wonderful organisations, academics and activists who have created a wealth of knowledge about this region and its connections to African enslavement. But very rarely has the church been part of that conversation. And I think the bit of public knowledge that needs to be added is recognising the role that the church played, both practically but also theologically, in the expansion of African enslavement in, across Western Africa and into the Caribbean and America. Because without the theological framework that sat behind that dehumanized Black people of African descent, it's really unlikely we would be here. And recognizing that link between church and state was at that time almost one and the same thing. There was very little distinction between the two. So the reasons to say yes to slavery were Christian ideas. That's just it is historical fact. They were Christian ideas. And I think that if we're going to be honest about saying we want to tell the truth, then part of that has to be leaning into the truth that, as people who are part of the Church of England, that our history is entangled with that our history is entangled, and that our doctrines have been entangled in this, and that they've been used to perpetrate a great international harm, and that has to be acknowledged. If we're going to talk about from lament to action, we should be clear about what it is we're lamenting from. It isn't simply that we were involved. It isn't simply that we made money from it. It's that we were part of the orchestration of it.
Okay, fine. And also, okay, I think there is something, I think you're right. We have to be very, very careful about what, our understanding of what we are lamenting from. Because it becomes, yes, slavery was, the, transportation of people, and they worked in the fields and they did this. And that is the nice bit that people have about enslavement of people. And they never talk about the horrendous stuff that has actually come from that, because I think very few people know about that. People don't know, as I wrote to Leona about the Aragon case, which is, it brought out the fact that it was common practice. You've had a long journey, people are, okay, let's just take him, let's chop him up, let's feed him to the rest of the slaves. We're not talking about, so we have that in terms of our history, all these horrors, whether or not it's the use of our skin for leather, whether or not, it's, getting people as a punishment to, which was advocated, to defecate in one person's mouth. It's all of the stuff that needs to be brought up. So I thank you very much. We need to know the true horrors. And you can understand, well, not understand, but you have a more complete picture. And Malik, what do you feel that, in terms of what people should know? And do you feel that, yes?
Yeah, I've been doing some work with the with St. George's Church in Everton, the Cast Iron Church, which was actually set up when Everton was a gated community for rich merchants. It's high up on the hill. They could see their ships coming over the bar. And many of the people who are buried at St. George's were, in fact, slave merchants, including Samuel Sandbach, who enslaved my own ancestors. He's buried there. So I did a seminar there with the local priest called Who Lies Here? And it was a double entendre, basically, who lies here, who's buried here, and who told lies here. And what I found was with the church, when we looked at the burial records, only half of the burial ground was used, because when the poor Irish people came in for the potato famine, all the slave traders decanted to Edgbeth. And then you'll see another cast iron church at St. Michael's there, where many slave traders are also buried there. And they never buried the poor people. So there was a class distinction, as well as this other sort of dimension that they had. But I recently travelled to Demerara, and I went to Christchurch in Commingsburg. And in Christchurch, I found the records of slave baptisms. And when you looked at the baptismal records within Christchurch, not just in Christchurch, but also St. George's Cathedral, which is the main cathedral named after, the same thing. We've got St. George's Church in Everton, where these slave traders were. Then they had in Demerara St. George's Cathedral. They were behind both of these churches. They funded them, and they were involved and instrumental in their development and their sort of mission, if you like. And when I looked at the records prior to 1833 and emancipation, I found individuals, just Europeans who'd been born, and it would have in the baptism records the date of birth, the date of baptism, the names of the parents, both parents, the profession of the father, and who oversaw the baptism. However, in the case of the enslaved, we start to see, after 1823, whole groups being brought from plantations to be baptized. These were enslaved people who did not have free will, but they were being collectively baptized at the behest of their owners, and they were recorded in the baptismal records, not with the date of birth, just the date of baptism, with a first name with no surname. And instead of the names of the parents, they had either the names of their owners or the name of the plantation, and in some cases, the government.
Yeah.
So there was an obscuring of the record. So when I want to find my enslaved ancestors' record there was a deliberate attempt by the church to obscure the record historically of the enslaved people who were being effectively compelled into baptism.
I'm just trying to pull that in. So how does that, what in terms of public knowledge then would you want to have from that experience?
Yes, so what I'm doing is, with regard to that, I'm digitizing all of those records.
Okay,
I can make them accessible and available, and then I'm having public discourses even within church settings, like we did with the church at St. George's Church in Everton, where people are coming and we're doing seminars on them and having discussions around this. What I'd like to see the church doing, though, is to invest in the digitization of these collections, because when I was in Demerara, and Leona will tell you this similar thing from her experience in Barbados, many of these unique exclusive records that exist nowhere else are crumbling. They are literally crumbling when you look at them, because nobody is investing any money in their preservation. And these records exist in one place and nowhere else. And they are inside individual churches. And these records are imperative for us understanding the historical context within which all of this occurred. So I think the church has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure the preservation of these archives, and they should make.
They have a duty of care. Duty of care. Because remember, they would be under the Anglican. It would be a duty of care.
I think there's a difference between the legal distinction of a duty of care and a fiduciary responsibility. The reason I use the term fiduciary responsibility is because they are custodians of that knowledge. They are trustees of that information, that they were instrumental in profiteering, if you like, also from that exploitation. Therefore, it should be their fiduciary responsibility as custodians and trustees of that knowledge to preserve that knowledge and make it available for future generations before that knowledge is destroyed. A duty of care exists primarily between two individuals or an institution and an individual at the time. Those people are long dead. So that duty of care was, then. The duty of care they have now is to their parishioners, not to the wider public. So that's the distinction I would make between a duty of care and a fiduciary responsibility.
Okay, thank you. And Malcolm.
Thanks. I will be very brief. So I'm going to go off my notes now. But I think for me, and particularly speaking with regards to the triangle, I come back to that thing around ignorance. What we're trying to do with the triangle is to empower activism by diminishing ignorance, by exposing people to the truth, helping them, giving them the tools to navigate what is true and what is untrue. And particularly we're thinking about our work with young people, many young people from around the world, young students as well, and others, just really giving them the tools that they need to be able to navigate. And we do that through all kinds of ways, through connecting and learning and friendship and lectures and workshops. I think if I can just speak very quickly on the youth pilgrimage, which is a big project within all of that, which is there are 3 cohorts every year of young people who journey together. It's a very much an immersive experience, a 3-year program, and it really is all about learning, listening, living together into the realities of and the legacies of our shared history from those very different perspectives. One of the tools that we use to do that, in fact, I've just noticed, actually, you can see it on my wall. I hadn't realized it was behind me, but the Sankofa symbol, the Adinkra symbol from the Akan tribe in West Africa. I've stood many times in the chapel above the male dungeon in Cape Coast Castle. I've wrestled with the complicity of the church, the theologizing of the enslavement of other human beings. I've placed my hand on that wall near the door of no return. I've stood at the last bath. I've been, I've made that pilgrimage so many times now with these different groups, and every single time, the thing that really I could go back to and say was life-changing was standing there with a Ghanaian or somebody from Barbados or Jamaica or from Virginia at our side. My colleague, the lead in Ghana, Father Nana Kessie, the last time we did that, we both broke down, and then we made the sign of the cross on each other's foreheads and said, that is the sign that is important here. That's now this is the sign that brings us to a place of hope, really. And I very much want to hear and respect what Malik is saying, but as a Christian person coming into this, part of what I'm doing is really reminding the church that hope, I believe, comes from God in Jesus. That is where, if we can't trust the institutions to get us to that better place, we just can't. We are broken.
Yes.
I think that's all I want to say for now. I know you've got some time.
Thank you. I think the last question I have, I'm going to ask people to be very brief, though it's the most optimistic question. I really want to get the questions in that people have asked us to. So I'm going to ask, if truths are properly heard, what can healing and repair looks like? And I'm going to ask Malik, if you could start. What does that look like for you? What does healing and repair look like to you?
I think healing and repair will have different dimensions for different groups who are affected in different ways. And I think the idea of a one-size-fits-all kind of solution is, I think it's idealistic and a bit utopian. I think what we need to have is the conversation. I think this conversation has not been had adequately. We don't have all the facts. If you wanted to know how to adjudicate a matter, you would be expected to be presented with all of the facts in order to be able to understand every dimension. And then once you understood that, you could then make informed choices about what you think might be the appropriate solutions. I think the starting point here is the beginning, not the end. We really
so you would say that it would be conversation, a reciprocal and open conversation.
I think we need
and
to
that has got to be the starting point, with no vested interest, but a real comprehensive 360 conversation with no vested interest. I'm going to ask now to Malik.
I'm sorry, one second. That's not what I meant.
Okay.
That's an outcome. What I'm talking about is having the facts laid out in front of us, which means having access to the information, the archival information, so that we can understand what dimensions need.
Okay, so access to information.
Yes.
Okay, and that's what healing and repair would look like.
It's a
access to information.
That's the starting point.
Okay, great. As a starting point. Thank you. Okay, and I'm going to go to Malcolm. What would healing and repair look like if people were told, if truths were told and heard properly?
Again, very conscious of time. I'm going to my last bit of my notes here, which is just to say, and it sounds a bit trite, I know, but for me, healing and repair, I'm absolutely respecting Malik's comments about there isn't a one size fits all, but it looks like communities which genuinely value each other and can celebrate and appreciate difference in each other, communities which hold fast to that which is true. And healing and repair in faith communities comes with a true sense of being part of a global family, created to be that family, really. In St. Gabriel's, we have an 8-foot nativity as you come in, and it is authentic as we believe we could possibly make it. It wasn't actually installed to try and make a point around authenticity. It's incredibly beautiful as it is, but it does remind us each and every time we see it that Jesus wasn't a white man. And I think healing and repair also comes with a reconfiguration or a recalibration of some of those fundamental defaults which are so pernicious in the church. If that's the right word. But Jesus wasn't a white man. Let's just start with the facts and allow that to reorientate some of our life together.
Okay, thank you. And Jennie?
Yeah, I think I would, to some extent, so it's me and Mal, probably because we are part of the same diocese and we work together frequently, are likely to have relatively similar answers. But I guess for me, healing and repair really looks like a commitment from the church to non-repetition. And I think in order to commit to non-repetition, I'd agree with Malik that you have to have all the information, because without it, how can you do that? How can you commit to it? But I think that if we could, I would hope that that commitment would do more than some of the more performative things that as a church we like to do. You know, the abilities to go, oh, we've got this many of this sort of people and these people are involved. And actually, instead, it should be I guess healing should look like communities where cohesion exists, where mutual support exists, communities that look like beloved communities, where we actually promote the humanity and value of all people, whether we consider them to be part of our sort of Christian communities or not. If they are humans, we should be fighting for their dignity, their respect. We should consider their worthiness to be absolute. And there shouldn't be a time when we think it's okay for that to be denigrated in any form. So I guess, that's quite a hopeful look to the future of Novelette, isn't it? And I don't know if I'm going to see that in my lifetime, but I would really love to.
I would love to as well. I mean, we can only work towards it, quite honestly, and we can only fight towards it, as I say, and learn to listen